Hello. A video conference again. We have only share from the presenters, but technology and new and brand new world.
Yeah, but it's definitely more motivating when it's physical.
I can imagine. But last year you got also.
Yeah, I had an online last year. I know. Yes.
See you around.
Know what to expect.
Yes. Video. And without. And one more without glasses. Thank you. Anna, can we start? Good morning. Welcome at the keynote session of Dr. Joeri, who is Director of Research and Reader in Science, in Climate Science and Policy at the Grantham Institute at Imperial College London, and a Senior Research Scholar at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. He explores how societies can transform towards more sustainable futures, connected Earth system sciences to the studies of societal change and policy. He has published on the effectiveness of international climate agreements, such as the Paris Agreement, carbon budgets, net zero emission targets, 1.5-degree emission pathways, and the interaction between climate and sustainable development. Rogelj has contributed to several climate change assessments over the past decade. He is a long-serving lead author on the annual emission gap reports by the United Nations Environment Programme, and he also contributed to the 5th assessment report of the IPCC. Served as a coordinating lead author on the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees of global warming, and as a lead author on the IPCC 6th assessment report. In the year 2019, he was the youngest member serving on the UN Secretary General's Climate Science Advisory Board. Joeri, please, the cloud is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the very kind introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here with you today, and it's really nice to have this opportunity to do this in this hybrid fashion. Today, I will not be talking about my research, but I will be talking about the work that we did under the banner of the IPCC 6th Assessment Report. So let me get my presentation going. And I hope that by now you can already see my first slide. So indeed, what I will want to try over the next 45 minutes is kind of to give a very broad overview of the key insights of the latest IPCC assessment. And as you might know, the IPCC consists of different working groups that cover different aspects of climate change. This is, here I will be presenting the assessment of Working Group 1, which focuses on the physical science of climate change. Now, I want to start with a look back at one day in August when we woke up to these newspaper headlines in the morning. I apologize that the headlines that I'm showing here are quite UK focused, but that's the ones I was able to collect. Well, you can see here stories in The Guardian: global climate crisis, inevitable, unprecedented and irreversible. The Financial Times mentioning world likely to be 1.5 degrees warmer by 2040. Code Red for Humanity on many front pages, and that was because the UN Secretary General used that in its statement. So all these front pages of newspapers all around the world, and there were really news stories about this report in virtually every country in the world, are due to this report. And this is the Working Group 1 contribution to the 6th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And it was the day before that the summary for policymakers, this document that summarizes the hundreds and thousands of pages of the report for policymakers, was approved by delegates in the first ever virtual session of the IPCC. Now, I'm presenting this report today, but it is clear that this report was not written by me alone. Actually, I want to start this presentation by highlighting the really wide group of authors that contributed to this. Here you can see a picture of the core author team, actually, during one of our lead author meetings when that was before the lockdowns started. So this was in Vancouver. And what you can see here is the coordinating and as well as the lead authors of the Working Group 1 report. These are even not all the authors. There's also hundreds of contributing authors that provide invaluable input to the different chapters with their expertise. And then there's even thousands of reviewers that will go through the documents and make sure that they are scientifically robust. And I hope and I assume that probably some of you are also today sitting in the room or listening in. So without all those contributions, this report would not be what it is and would not be so impactful. However, the authors are only one part of what the IPCC constitutes. The other and very important part of the IPCC is shown here in this picture. The IPCC is ultimately an intergovernmental organization founded in 1988, and it has 190 member countries. And here in this picture, you can see the delegates of those 190 member countries sitting. This was during a meeting in 2014, but sitting in a meeting and going sentence by sentence over the summary of the report to approve it. Now, the IPCC is tasked to assess our best available knowledge about climate change and has to do this in an open, inclusive, and transparent way. And just to give you a flavor of what this process implies, it is basically a co-design process where governments and scientists work together to ultimately provide a document that is as robust as possible scientifically, but also as useful as possible for policymakers. And here you can see kind of a timeline, or not a timeline, but a trajectory that is followed from the start, where governments decide on IPCC products, for example, how many reports will be written, which reports, over the scoping process, where experts and governments decide what the exact content will be of the various reports, to the publication of the report. And important here to notice is that everywhere where I marked a step in blue, so from the beginning, over the selection of the authors, the review and the approval of the different drafts, all the blue steps are steps where governments provide input and where there's interaction with governments. This really highlights that this is a really integrated process, and that really also explains that why these reports are so impactful. Not only do they provide our best available assessment of the climate science, but they also provide a product that is co-designed, co-developed with governments, and where governments thus are which governments later on are eager to use. A last slide of introduction on the report, what went really into it. So we had an author team of more than 230 authors from 65 countries, about a third women and the rest men. 30% of those authors were totally new to the IPCC. 2/3 were actually newly took up leading roles, and that's important. We want this not to be, or the IPCC doesn't want this to be kind of an exclusive club of a few people, but it is really valuable to have this turnover of people with always fresh eyes and fresh perspectives. The review process of the report is extremely exhaustive. We reviewed in total 14,000 scientific publications, or assessed those as part of the work that went into this report. During the different review rounds, we received 78,000 review comments, and we need to respond to each of those comments in writing, one by one. And all those responses will also be published afterwards online. And finally, we had 46 countries that ultimately also commented on the final government distribution, which is the very latest draft before it is being approved. So, with all this context and introduction, I hope that by now, if this simple cover of this report already has a bit of a different meaning about all the work and all the effort and process that goes into preparing such a report. So what I want to do now over the course of the remainder of this presentation is really look at some of the key findings. And I will always start with one of the key messages that came out of the report, and then we would like to look at the underlying evidence that supports those key messages. The first message, key message that was plastered all over the media was recent changes in the climate are widespread, rapid, intensifying, and unprecedented in thousands of years. So that is a very strong statement. Let's see what the underlying evidence was that the report provides to support this. The first piece of evidence is that human influence has warmed the climate at a rate that is really unprecedented in at least 2,000 years. It's shown here in this figure, and many of the figures that I'm drawing from here in this presentation are from the summary, but I'm also drawing a bit on figures from the individual chapters where I wanted to highlight a bit more of the detail. And what you can see here is kind of a depiction of the famous hockey stick figure that has been part of the IPCC reports for a very long time. And what this basically shows is reconstructed historical temperatures for the last 2,000 years and then observed temperatures for the last 2 centuries, roughly. And what you can simply see already visually from this figure is how the change in warming in the last 2 centuries is really unprecedented compared to what we have experienced and what our societies have experienced over the last 2,000 years. But the global warming is not the only dimension in which we can say that the human influence on the climate is really unprecedented. Another dimension that we can look at is the perturbation of biogeochemical cycles. This is just a blanket word for saying the CO2 concentrations, the methane concentrations, or the nitrous oxide concentrations in the atmosphere. And, well, here you see two panels. The top panel shows atmospheric CO2 concentrations, and the bottom panel shows the growth rate of those concentrations. And what you can see in the top panel is that current atmospheric concentrations in the atmosphere are unprecedented for, and the report says, for the last 2 million years. So what we have here on the right-hand side, this is the current period. Here, the panel on the left of it is for the last 2,000 years. Then we look 800,000 years back with data from ice cores, and then we look even 60 million years back with data from sediment cores. And so based on this data, we can now say that the current level of concentrations, of CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere is unprecedented in the last 2 million years. As you can see, there have even been periods in the very deep past when there were no human societies around where CO2 concentrations were higher. But even there, if we then look at the CO2 growth rate, so how fast we are changing our environment, also there we see that what is happening now is fundamentally different from what has happened over the past 60 million years. Here you can see the growth rate, and these small insets, they show the actual growth rate over different time horizons. This is for the last 200 years, this is for the last 100,000 years, and the left one here is for 10 to 40 million years before present. What is important to note here is that the units are different. The panel on the right shows changes in parts per million per year. This panel shows parts per million per century, and the panel on the left shows parts per million per 10,000 years. So it clearly shows that what we are experiencing today is several orders of magnitude faster than what we have experienced over the last 60 million years. And we don't have only evidence for CO2 concentrations. The same type of evidence is available for other greenhouse gases. Here, the top panel, this is only until 800,000 years because we only have that data from ice cores. shows CO2 concentrations, methane concentrations, and N2O concentrations, nitrous oxide concentrations. And also here on the right-hand side, you can again see the growth rates. The gray ones are those over the last 800,000 years. The blue ones are those over the last century, roughly. The bars have the same height, but the units again are different. Here we have parts per billion per year, and here parts per billion per 10,000 years, or per 1,000 years, sorry. Again, showing that what we are experiencing today, also in methane and N2O changes, is several orders of magnitude faster than what we have experienced over the last 800,000 years. And that includes several glacial and interglacial cycles. Going on to the next high-level statement, then it is indisputable that human activities are causing this change, making extreme climate events, including heat waves, heavy rainfall, and droughts, more frequent and severe. So the evidence that I showed before, the fact that it warms and that CO2 concentrations and methane concentrations are increasing, doesn't yet make the link with the fact, or with the cause of this increase. Doesn't tell us yet who is actually responsible, or which process is responsible for the changes that we can measure and that we can observe. So here we have a different set of evidence that tells us, or that tells us unequivocally that human activities play a dominant role in the growth of atmospheric CO2 concentrations. And there are 4 lines of evidence that I want to highlight here, and each panel supports 1 or 2 of them. The first line of evidence is here in the left-hand panel. There, what that panel shows is just over time the actual atmospheric measurements of CO2 concentrations. And you can see that these are gradually increasing from 1960 to 2020. The small wiggles are the interannual variabilities, because there is more forest in the northern hemisphere than there is in the southern hemisphere. So if there's winter or summer in the northern hemisphere changes global CO2 concentration slightly, but you can see that there is still a clearly upward trend. And the pink line here shows the difference between 2 measurements between the northern and the southern hemisphere, with higher CO2 concentrations be available in the northern hemisphere. And because most of the fossil fuel combustion in industrial regions is situated in the northern hemisphere, this is the first kind of fingerprint that we understand the source of this CO2 increase. The other lines of evidence are, however, even more compelling. The second and the third line of evidence is shown here in this panel on the right, where you can see kind of the decrease in carbon-14 and the ratio of carbon-13 to carbon-12. And what you can see is that both of those are decreasing. The decrease in the radioactive carbon-14 tells us that the carbon that is added to the atmosphere is very old, because it's depleted in all of the radioactive isotopes that were originally in there. And that's a clear indication that it is coming from fossil fuels. Another example, or another line of evidence that it is coming from fossil fuels, is the decrease in the ratio of carbon-13, which is depleted also in fossil fuels, because fossil fuels were originally plants, and plants preferentially take up carbon-12. So from both these lines of evidence, we know that the CO2 that is added to the atmosphere comes from a originally biological source, but which has been stored for a very, very long time, so fossil fuels. And the last piece of evidence is here the ratio of oxygen to nitrogen in the atmosphere, which is also declining, not drastically, but measurably, and with a rate that exactly explains the amount of oxygen that would be required to combust all the carbon that is required to add the CO2. Again, showing that the CO2 that is added to the atmosphere is the result of a combustion process. So with these four lines of evidence, the IPCC was able to establish absolutely unequivocally that this increase in CO2 in the atmosphere is indeed the result of human activities. With additional methods, we can then also start to apply this to the warming that we are experiencing. On the left-hand side, you can see, again, the figure I showed, the hockey stick figure I showed before, and on the right-hand side is actually a figure that shows or that contrasts the amount of global warming that could be increased by natural drivers only, which is here in the green-blue color at the bottom, so solar and volcanic changes, and then the warming that can be explained by simulated human and natural forcing in the brown at the top. And that is then compared to the observed global warming, which is there in the very wiggly black line over time. And with this illustration, you can see that natural forcing, which we also understand quite well, can by far not explain any of the global warming that we have seen in recent decades. Also, now that we understand that CO2 increase is caused unequivocally by our human activities, we can now also attribute this warming unequivocally to human activities. Another way of looking at that is in the next figure that the IPCC has included in its summary for policymakers, and where this total warming, which is shown here as this gray bar, can be split up in the different contributions. A first method to splitting this up is called attribution studies, which don't allow for a very detailed split up, but allow to split up the total warming in the contribution attributed to human greenhouse gases. This is the second red bar here, and then the cooling of other human drivers such as aerosol or air pollution. And I think the bottom line of this figure is basically that human activities are responsible for 100% of current warming. Another more sophisticated way of looking or trying to look at the same question is through radiative forcing studies, and these provide slightly bit more detail. Here you can see again the same global bar being split up in many different contributors. What is interesting to highlight here is mainly the largest bars. The two bars on the left are for carbon dioxide and for methane, and the largest cooling bar is for sulfur dioxide, really clearly showing the importance of tackling both carbon dioxide and methane for limiting climate change, but also to keep in mind that as we will be cleaning up our skies from air pollution, the current cooling effect that these particles or these polluting particles in the atmosphere have will disappear. So we also need to take that into account when designing climate policies. And to be honest, in most cases, these are indeed being taken into account. Next statement then is that climate change is already affecting every region on Earth in multiple ways, and the changes we experience will increase with further warming. Here, the sixth assessment report was really able to do something very new that the IPCC was not able to do yet in the last assessment report that was published in 2013 and 2014. And that is really to make an inventory of the observed changes in extreme events. Here it shows the changes in hot extremes, and combine that with the confidence that we have that these changes can be attributed to human activities. So what you can see here in this graph is kind of a very, it's a stylized representation of different regions of the world. I hope you can kind of see the world map in there. Every tile that is red, there we have seen an increase in observed changes. Every tile where there are 3 dots included, we have high confidence that this is due to human activities. And you can see that in pretty much all the tiles where we see an increase, there is at least medium, if not high confidence, that the changes that have been observed are part of, are caused by human activities. The same kind of overview is shown for heavy precipitation. As you can see here, there are other regions where that provide a clear trend here. So the signal is a bit more noisy here, and you can also see that the amount of agreement is much less, and that is simply because there is much more interannual variability in precipitation, so it's much harder to detect the signal from the noise. And the same is true if we look at agricultural and ecological drought. Important to see here is also that we have several regions, and I think particularly here for heavy precipitation, that is something to highlight, that are colored gray. And that really shows that there is limited data or literature in those regions. And it actually also really shows kind of an inequality in the amount of literature, science, and observations that are available in the developed compared to the developing world. So these pictures really show more than just a scientific assessment, but also show something about the capacity of certain regions to do research and understand their environment. Also, beyond these general extreme events, the IPCC shows that it is likely, so that is with greater than 66% probability, that the global proportion of major category 3 to 5 tropical cyclones has increased over the last 4 decades. And that this increase cannot be explained by natural variability alone. And it also highlights that there is a strong increase in what we call compound extreme events. That is, for example, heat waves that come together with droughts, or fire weather, that is weather that is particularly subject or that is particularly favorable to producing fire in forests. And that is really found to increase also in all inhabited regions. Now, these impacts will increase further. With every increment of global warming, changes get larger at both at the regional and the local scale. Here in this figure, at the top, it shows the comparison between observed changes and simulated changes at 1 degree of global warming. Just goes to show that, or kind of shows that models are quite well at capturing these changes. And then at the bottom, you can see how the warming changes over time with per half a degree of warming. Well, for 1.5, for 2 degrees, and then on the right-hand side for 4 degrees. You can clearly see that some aspects that we know as the land-sea contrast, the land warms more than the ocean, and also that a feature which we call the polar amplification, the Arctic warms more than the global average, and that is because as the white surface or snow-covered surface melts, the darker surface absorbs more radiation, and that increases the local warming. The same kind of trends can also be found for precipitation and soil moisture. And here you can see that, particularly here on the right, there are clear regions where we will see a strong intensification of precipitation, particularly here in the monsoon regions. And then there are also regions that will be that are likely to experience much more drier conditions, the Mediterranean being a typical example of where that signal is very strong. Now, most of those are average changes. We can also look at this in terms of extremes. And here, this figure shows how hot extremes over land change with global warming, and shows the assessment of it. It shows this for a 10-year extreme event or a 50-year extreme event. And let us just look here on the right-hand side to what that tells us. It basically tells that a 50-year event that maybe our grandparents or great-grandparents would experience once in their lifetime, so from 1859 to 1900, is now already likely to occur once every 10 years. If we now increase warming to 1.5 or even 2 degrees, with 2 degrees of warming, an extreme event, a 1 in 50 years extreme event for our great-grandparents would occur around once every 4 years. And at 4 degrees of warming, that will simply be the new norm of almost every year. Just goes to show that the experience of the past at some point will become very irrelevant to what we are experiencing today and what we will be experiencing in the future. Now, I want to go to have a look at that future and look at what the IPCC says about future changes. And it has this key message here that there is no going back from some changes in the climate system, but some changes could be slowed and others could be stopped by limiting warming. And to look into the future, the IPCC Working Group 1 makes use of scenarios as tools to understand the global future. The IPCC reports are should be policy relevant, but also policy neutral. So the IPCC doesn't pick their scenarios, but has selected these 5 scenarios as a set that spans the entire literature, from the very highest emission scenario, which is labeled SSP 5 8.5, which basically involves a reversal of some of the climate policies that we see today, a recarbonization of our energy system, and thus very high emissions, to a pathway that goes to net zero, that starts reducing emissions immediately and gets to net zero CO2 emissions in the 2050s. These scenarios, they do not just describe CO2 emissions, but also all the other greenhouse gases. Here on the right, we show just a few, a selected few of those. Now let's have a look at what that tells us in terms of temperature outcomes. For the highest scenario, we would see warming rise over the next couple of decades and until the end of the century, well beyond 4 degrees, which was the highest level that I highlighted in the previous slides. But for the lowest 2 scenarios, we see that which reached zero emissions over the course of this century, we see that warming can be halted and even gradually reversed until the end of the century. In the near term, however, despite the emissions being very different, the changes between the different warming projections are not yet that clear. The changes in the absolute warming are not that different, but the changes in the rate are already incredibly important. Here, by the 2040s, for example, many scenarios are somewhere between 1.5 and 2, but some have already stopped warming and have stabilized, while others are still increasing their temperatures massively. Now, how does this reflect onto other components of the climate system? In the interest of time, I will just look here at at the ocean acidification. And what you can see here is the reduction in the pH of the surface ocean corresponding to these different scenarios. And what you can see is that the change in acidification actually goes almost in lockstep with the changes in emissions and in warming. What you can see that even in the lowest scenarios, ocean acidification is gradually reversed until the end of the century. So this is one part of the Earth system that responds quite rapidly to our actions. Another aspect, however, that responds very slowly is sea level rise, which where you can see the projections here. And until the end of the century, under all scenarios, even those that halt and even slowly reverse warming, sea level rise is still continuing. There is a clear difference between the different scenarios, but all of them are still increasing. What you can also see here, and this is an important innovation of the latest IPCC report, is that we highlight there some of the low likelihood but highly impactful events that could happen. And this is this dashed line is the level of sea level rise that we would get under the highest scenario if one particular process of which we are very uncertain but which we can't exclude would be triggered. So if that process in which makes ice cliffs unstable would be triggered, then we would see almost a meter additional warming. So as you can see from this figure, global sea level rise doesn't stop yet in 2100, and so we can look further into the future to see where we end up. And this panel here at the bottom, which is now very hard to read, is the same panel as in the previous slide. And here on the right-hand slide, you can see now on the same scale how much sea level rise we would be getting under the second lowest and the highest scenario by the year 2300. And what you can see is that under all these scenarios, there will be more sea level rise. And sea level rise of 0.5 meter to 3 meters under a 2-degree pathway is clearly something that is still in play. For the high emission scenarios, much higher levels of sea level rise are still to be counted with, even up to 15 meters if we also take into account that highly unlikely but very impactful process of marine ice cliff instability. So finally, and I want to then stop with that, is what do we need to do to halt warming? What does the IPCC tells us there? We have now increased and very strong evidence that to limit warming, strong, rapid and sustained reductions in CO2, methane and other greenhouse gases are necessary. And this will not only reduce consequences of climate change, but also improve air quality. And here I want to show, or I want to illustrate it with this figure, which is again one from the summary for policymakers. And this figure, instead of time on the horizontal axis, it basically shows cumulative emissions. So the total amount of CO2 that we have ever emitted in the atmosphere starting from 1850. And here on the left, you can see the historical warming. And then on the right, you can again see the different scenarios now until 2050. And what this clearly shows is this very nearly linear trend between, or linear relationship between global cumulative CO2 emissions and global warming. But it also shows, and that's here at the bottom, which just shows bars of the different cumulative emissions implied by the 5 scenarios over the next 3 decades, is that the next 3 decades will really be absolutely essential in determining where we will end up in terms of global warming, be it 1.5 or already well beyond 2 degrees by the mid of the century. I want to close this presentation with a figure that is actually not from the IPCC, but instead comes from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change latest NDC synthesis report. And in this, NDC stands for Nationally Determined Contribution, or the pledges that countries have put forward as part of their commitments under the Paris Agreement. And what you can see here are global greenhouse gas emissions. The yellow line is the central scenario of, that was assessed in the IPCC report, AR6, that leads to 2.7 degrees of warming by the end of the century. And here the red cone, or the red triangle, is the United Nations Framework Convention's best assessment of the emissions implied by the current pledges of countries. And I just want to put this figure up as the last image of this presentation, because this really connects what the IPCC does with what needs to happen in the real world. And so this is one example of how the IPCC informs the international climate negotiations, and how also it informs what is necessary from COP26, the climate summit in November in Glasgow, in terms of delivering on strengthened and more ambitious greenhouse gas emission reduction pledges under the Paris Agreement. And with that, I thank you all for your attention, and thank you again for the invitation, and I will be very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Joeri. I can see a hand raised over there.
Hi, thanks for the very clear presentation. Yannick here from University of Canterbury, New Zealand. The 2-degree scenario is not a goal, right, but a place where you would like not to be. I think you illustrated that in the slide on the sea level rise, and I was wondering what your reactions on that statement is, and what other extreme consequences we see if we operate under the logic of the 2 degrees, which again is something we would be wanting to be distant from.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I think your statement is absolutely, in my view, absolutely uncontroversial. So already under the Paris Agreement, yeah, we are not trying to reach 2 degrees. We are trying to hold warming well below 2 degrees and pursue efforts to limit it to 1.5. As part of the, there was a process in the UNFCCC that was called the 2013 to 2015 review, where policymakers took all the evidence and looked at and tried to answer what the most appropriate temperature goal would be. And as part of that process, what came out is that and you can read that in that report, also in the UNFCCC, they say 2 degrees is not a safe limit. It's not a guardrail against which you can lean, but it's a defense line from which you want to stay as far away as possible. And I think the evidence of the report also clearly shows that. It shows it in terms of extreme events that increase. It shows it in terms of cumulative impacts or processes in the climate system that have a cumulative impact, like sea level rise, like even permafrost melt. Many of the aspects, and I didn't have time to go into it in this presentation, but the IPCC also looks at the more uncertain kind of tipping points, which can be really impactful, but are very often very uncertain, and for which we don't really exactly know or can determine when they will happen. The one thing we do know is the lower we keep warming, the lower the likelihood that they will be triggered. Some of them might be already triggered today, including permafrost melt, which is already ongoing. So I fully agree that 2 degrees is not an aspirational goal, it's not a target to hit, it is, we want to limit warming well below 2 degrees and stay as far away from 2 degrees of warming as we possibly can.
Thank you. Here, Shir, please.
Thank you very much for the presentation. This is Shir Kokish from Working Group 3. And I would just like to mention that the summary for policymakers of the Working Group 1 contribution has been very impactful and very helpful for us also to communicate the most recent findings of the IPCC to national institutions as well. One of the most impactful figures, as you also showed in the presentation, was how many more times the frequency and intensity of climate impacts will increase in any other scenario other than 1.5. And in this respect, also the interactive atlas that the IPCC presented for the first time this round, could you mention a little bit about that? And also for the impacts that are especially expected for the Mediterranean, because this part of the world where most of us are coming from, this region, is warming faster than some of the other regions of the world. So this is maybe we would like to hear more from you. And thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And actually, I had a slide, but I ran out of time, so I'm going to share it now. So as part of the IPCC sixth assessment report, there was also one really important innovation, which I think is really valuable for anyone working in climate, be it a researcher or someone in an administration who tries to understand better what the implications are of the assessment for their specific region and their specific local situation. So the IPCC has published, and it's freely available online, an interactive atlas where you can explore different scenarios, where you can zoom into regions. You can not only look at kind of the temperature assessment, but also at the assessment of the various literature that is available for what is happening and what is projected to happen in a particular region. So here you could look into the Mediterranean and really draw out all the evidence that is available. So I can warmly recommend anyone to that is interested to go to that website and to check this out. It has already been highly successful and highly popular. So and we are very happy that it is, of course. And I don't want to go too much detail because it would just lead us too far. But indeed, there are very important regional differences in the climate signal that we will be seeing. And very importantly, the Mediterranean region is one of those regions where we see a very clear signal of drying. And that is interesting because in a warmer atmosphere, actually, we would expect, or no, we know from basic physics, a warmer atmosphere can contain more water vapor. And what goes in the atmosphere also comes down, so you would expect that you wouldn't see that much drying, but that water or that precipitation really comes down in a very unequal way, with some regions experiencing much more intense periods of precipitation, while others actually still drying, and the Mediterranean is one of those regions.
Question here and then there.
Hello, thanks for the nice presentation. I am Eugenio Molina from Alcalá University in Spain. My question is, well, those infographics were great, but I was wondering why 1850-1900 was chosen as a baseline period, because it's kind of far away and difficult for us to relate the changes to that period. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so that choice is actually 1850 to 1900 is taken as a proxy for pre-industrial conditions. And the reason why related back to pre-industrial conditions is that the international climate targets, the 1.5 degrees of warming, 2 degrees of warming, and every time there is a level mentioned, this is relative to pre-industrial conditions. Of course, the Industrial Revolution started in 1750, but until 1850, we have actually observational records, and so our estimate of the warming since 1850-1900 is the most accurate one. If you go further in time, there might be still like a tenth of a degree difference until 1750, but ultimately that is kind of relatively minor compared to the warming that we are experiencing today. In terms of why do we express changes in extremes compared to 1850, 1900? Well, it's the same reason. So we can link them to particular warming levels. If you would express them relative to, for example, 1950, 2000, then it would be harder for us to link them to, than for example, the increase in extreme events would be relative to that period. The global warming would be expressed to a different period, and so ultimately we thought that would be more confusing than helpful. Of course, one can always do the calculations oneself. Unfortunately, that's not part of what we have in the report.
Yeah, and the last page.
My name is Luís Serrano. I come from Portugal, and I want to thanks for your impressive work and for this very interesting presentation. And I have two questions. The first one is that about the relation between carbon and oxygen. You said that it correlates well with the combustion, but what about deforestation? What is the contribution about deforestation that we felt in the globe in the last century? It also, I think it will have an impact on that relation, but what could be the real impact of that? And also about that interesting graphic showing us that we have CO2 contribution and methane also. But I was very surprised about the importance and the relevance about the methane. And we all talk about CO2, but we saw that methane also plays an important role in that global warming. So what do you think also about that? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for those questions. So your first question, indeed, it's fossil fuels and deforestation. Deforestation currently, annual emissions, roughly a tenth of fossil fuel emissions. So it's not negligible, yet it's clearly an order of magnitude smaller than what fossil fuels are currently causing. But equally an important aspect to be dealt with, in particular because restoration of ecosystems can actually help to also increase the resilience of those systems in taking up carbon. Part of our carbon that we put in the atmosphere is indeed taken up by the land and the ocean carbon sinks. Your second question was on, wait, can someone remind me?
Is methane,
yes.
Methane contribution.
Yes, so the methane contribution is indeed important, and the big difference between methane and CO2 is that CO2, basically, some of the CO2 that we put in the atmosphere is forever. We put it in the atmosphere, some of it gets redistributed in the ocean, some is in the land, some stays in the atmosphere for tens of thousands of years, and this is basically forever on human timescales. Methane is very different. It warms a lot, but it has an atmospheric lifetime of let's say, of a decade. So that means if we reduce emissions, if we reduce methane emissions, the concentrations will quite quickly decrease, and the warming of methane will disappear. Whereas if we bring CO2 emissions to zero, the warming of CO2 won't disappear, it will merely stabilize. So we won't add any more to the warming, but we also won't, it won't disappear. And that is the big difference with methane. Both are very important, and both are parts of an integrated approach to limiting warming to as deep levels as possible.
Okay, do we have questions from the chat?
Yes, we have one question.
Yes, there was one question that I saw on the issue on permafrost, and I'm happy to respond to that. Yes, the permafrost is an important component of the Earth system. So the question is whether, what do we do about the assessment of permafrost, and whether there is evidence for kind of methane bombs or something, quote unquote, methane bombs. Well, our assessment is that the permafrost will definitely contribute and is already contributing, but there is very little evidence that there would be these kind of sudden releases of methane that would happen at the global scale. So what we see there is a very important distinction between what can happen at the very local scale, in a single lake, in a very particular geography, and what can happen across the entire Arctic, across all the permafrost of the Arctic, in order to have a global impact. So in permafrost we can see localized abrupt changes, but our best assessment is still that this would provide, or this will result in a steady contribution of additional methane and CO2 emissions to the atmosphere, which ultimately will further exacerbate with global warming, or with our human contribution also increasing. So the warmer we make it, actually the harder it will be to stabilize warming thereafter, and potentially we will be needing even carbon dioxide removal at the global scale simply to stabilize global warming if we let temperature rise too high in the first place.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Rogelj. And before closing the session, I just want to reflect on your last slide. We've seen that even though with many strong messages coming out of IPCC fifth assessment report, we didn't manage to persuade the world to deliver on 2 degree or 1.5 degree pathways. So what is your opinion? Are you optimistic that with the new findings of assessment report number 6, the science will be able to persuade the policymakers to go for a better climate future of the Earth?
Yes, good question. Thank you for this one. Well, I think I'm always optimistic, and I'm also realistic. I know that science in itself doesn't persuade anyone, because we are not always rational beings, and it's not because we have all the evidence that we make the right decisions. And I think with climate change, it is the same. But I'm optimistic in a way. I mean, let's start this by saying that the best time to have started climate action was 3 decades ago, and we should have started, and a decade ago was also better. But now we are where we are today, and there is still a lot that we can avoid in terms of climate impact. And I think the big difference is that the science is established, and Working Group 1 once again. Now there is really no doubt, no doubt that it is happening, that we are responsible for the many changes that we are seeing. But I think the most important change in the story or in the context is what Working Group 3, so the Working Group on Solutions and on Climate Change Mitigation will provide us. And there is really a total shift happening in the energy economy, in our societal context. And even if that is still not going fast enough at this stage, that makes me optimistic that together with the knowledge and the evidence that we have to do something about it, we now also have the options and in many cases also the imagination of where we want to go. And one can see it with many countries putting net zero targets these years, or in the past couple of years. Of course, these are just targets. Now we need plans to implement them. But I think that is a really important aspect where countries as a whole, the businesses in those countries, the civil society understands that just reducing emissions is not enough. It is really to stop adding CO2 to the atmosphere, to stop using the atmosphere as a free waste dump for combustion gases, is basically where this needs to be heading. And there I'm optimistic. I'm pretty sure that the climate summit in Glasgow won't solve it all, but I'm optimistic to see good progress there, both on mitigation and on delivery on finance, the 100 billion or more that is needed to support developing countries in their adaptation and mitigation efforts to make this transition together.
Thank you, Dr. Rogelj. Please join me in applauding Dr. Rogelj for this excellent presentation. Thank you also everybody for the contributions, and now it's lunch break. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yes.
From my mouth. I am pessimistic because the politicians ignore, they are jealous, and they don't listen. And that's what we told last time with the world meeting, political
može da se i ona, postoji mogućnost da se oni čuju istovremeno ili tako? Ok. Aha, to bi, onda samo dok ona priča, molim vas da se može i ona čuti. Sad. Molim? Mari, please start it, please, you can now talk. Just say something.
Okay, yeah, hello, everybody.
Okay, now we can hear you, Marie. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. And how are you? I hope you are enjoying Dubrovnik.
Yes, I'm fine, yes. I was looking 2 days running around here to find you, but now I see you are trapped in a Zoom room.
Yes, I'm really sorry I can't be there. I'm amazing. I'm imagining it's amazing to be there, but this was not my luck this time.
When I remember right, we met more than 15 years ago here in Dubrovnik, that's right?
Yeah, maybe, yeah, time flies, huh?
I think maybe we wait another minute because people, I'm not sure whether they are more in the lunch or whether they are at the beach, I don't know, but I think we start in a minute.
Okay.
I don't know if you can see the audience, but at the moment we might be 30 people.
Okay.
Henrik Lund is
well,
shaking.
As long as those 30 people can stay awake, then I guess it's a success. It's tough to come just after lunch.
Yep. But I think at least I start to introduce Marie. And Marie Münster is professor with special responsibility. Today I learned what a WSR means. And she is a professor in energy system modeling at the Technical University of Denmark. She holds a Master of Science in Energy Planning and a PhD in Energy Modeling. Marie Münster has extensive experience within the field of energy system modeling, with focus on integrated energy systems and smart sector coupling, analyzing technologies producing power, heat, gas, and transport fuels. She has been project leader and work package lead on several Danish and international research projects. And now we are looking forward to listen to her lecture, The Impact of Sector Coupling on Future Energy Systems. Marie, the floor, or better to say the screen, is yours.
Thanks a lot for your kind introduction. Let me just see if this works. So do you see a nice red slide?
Yeah, it's in progress. Yes, it's perfect now.
Okay. Okay, so thanks for inviting me to give a speech. So as mentioned, my name is Marie Münster. I'm a professor at the Technical University of Denmark, and I want to give a speech on sector coupling and the impact on future energy systems. So I think this is a really nice reminder that although we talk a lot about climate change, there are other planetary boundaries that we are close to reaching, and also some that we are already reaching. And we have to keep in mind that biosphere integrity and biogeochemical flows and also land system change are quite severely affected as it is now. And we have to make sure that when we do this transition, this green transition, and minimize climate change, we have to make sure we don't have a bad impact on these other spheres. So recently the IPCC came out with a report saying that yes, temperatures are rising, and also that this is mainly due to human activities. So if we look now a bit, zoom in on small Denmark as a case and say, well, how has it been going there? And maybe use this a bit to look into what could happen in other countries. We have been quite successful in increasing the share of wind power for electricity production, as you can see on the left. And we have increased the share of renewables in general. You see in green a lot of wind power, but also some biomass and some waste is used. So for the electricity supply, it's going rather well in terms of integrating renewables. But if we look forward and we say, well, what are some of the greenhouse gas challenges, then we can see that although with the blue, we're really decreasing these emissions from both electricity and district heating, we still, with the purple, have quite a high impact from the transport sector. And with the green in the bottom, we have the agriculture, forestry, and fishing. So, and we also have some from the production industries, from fuel production and waste and the F-gases. So, the point just being that we have in the energy modeling community for some years been focusing on electricity and heating, and we really need to expand our view to focus on other sectors as well. And this is where it becomes relevant to look into sector coupling. So recently we did a report at DTU about smart energy systems and sector coupling, and we kind of see it this way, that in the top you have all the different energy sources, and traditionally these energy sources we've been able to generate electricity flexibly. But now that we have more and more wind and solar and other variable renewables coming in, we need to look to have this flexibility supplied by other parts of the system. So we can talk about the services in the bottom, where we can have a flexible demand, and we can talk about the system where we may be able to convert from one type of energy to another. And so we can have vector coupling. And what we see is then a potential for flexible consumption, for storage and for transmission, so that we can have the flexibility from the other parts of the system. We may use power to produce gas, we may have surplus heat from that, we may use power to produce heat. So all in all, the question becomes, how can we have an efficient way of having these systems and infrastructures work together efficiently? So basically, what we talk about is power to other sectors. It could be direct electrification, which is very efficient in many circumstances. And then for some sectors, it's difficult to electrify completely. And we can talk about indirect electrification, for example, by using electricity to produce hydrogen and thereby to produce fuels. And we can talk about how the other sectors can supply flexibility and storage to the power sector. So there is a win-win on both sides. So if we define sector coupling, we can talk about end-use sector coupling, and we can also talk about cross-vector coupling, and basically energy vector coupling and energy systems integration. So there are different terms, but basically talking about how can we have these different systems interacting in an efficient way. If one picture of which type of technologies that could be involved, we have the electricity supply, and we can have electric mobility, direct electricity to the transport sector, or we can have power to gas, converting these gas into synthetic fuels for the transport sector, or maybe storing and moving back to electricity, or we can utilize electricity for heating and maybe synthetic gases for heating as well. So we have this system where we can convert to and fro. And in this picture, there's not a focus on excess heat, but for many of these processes, we have excess heat that we can utilize. So, sorry, my computer is freezing. The European Commission has made a bid on how much will we see of increased electricity demand depending on different scenarios. And if you look to the right, you have the two scenarios which adhere to the Paris Agreement. And in both these cases, we have either 100% or 150% increase in the electricity demands. So basically, we will see a lot of increase in these demands. And we need to make sure we can handle that in the future. Some of the research needs we identified in connection with our project at DTU, I want to show. So basically, we want a green transformation. We want industrial development and consumer focus. So we want this to be cheap. We want to have the objectives fulfilled, that we can get flexibility, integration, optimization, and automation. And we do this by applying smart technologies, but also system architecture and control and digitalization. This needs to be facilitated by good framework conditions and is based on the development of cybersecurity and robustness. And today I'll talk about this system architecture and control and show two different articles and results from those articles. Both these articles were based on large-scale energy system optimization. And basically we need to distinguish, because we can model sector-coupled systems at a plant level. And often that is done in the sense that we assume all others equal. So we assume we don't have an impact on the remaining system. We may assume a certain number of operating hours and use, for example, average electricity and heat prices for the analysis. We might go into more detail, for example, on the internal heat optimization, and the results may be the levelized cost of energy, not including system costs or the competition between fuels, for example, or competition between technologies, for example, for cheap electricity. And we also get local emissions. If we look at large-scale energy system optimization, what we can take into account is how we integrate variable renewable energy production, such as wind and solar. We can assess competition between different technologies, as well as their synergies between generation, storage, transmission, or flexible demands. We can find location of the renewable energy sources and energy infrastructure, and therefore find optimal locations. We can look into international energy markets, power markets, gas markets, fuel markets, and we can find the impact we may have on energy prices and operating hours, i.e. we don't assume all others equal, we do have an impact on the surrounding system. And we can find system costs on electricity and district heating prices and system emissions. So the article I first want to tell you some results from is the role of sector coupling in the green transition and least cost energy system development in Northern and Central Europe towards 2050. I wrote it together with some colleagues, and the main author was a PhD student named Joeri Bermudez. We did this as part of the Norains project, and we used Balmoral for the analysis. So for Balmoral, we have heat and electricity demands as inputs. We have fuel prices and emissions, efficiencies and costs. We look at hourly distribution of demands and production from renewable sources, and we take into account capacities of existing plants and transmission, and we sometimes use time aggregation, particularly for the investment analysis. Then on the output side, we get the energy conversion, the fuel electricity consumption, the electricity import export, emissions, investments in plants and transmission lines, electricity and district heating, and prices on traded energy and total costs. The model can be run as linear programming or mixed integer programming, where we can take, for example, economy of scale into account. We can have myopic investments or rolling horizon investments. And basically, some of the assumptions we do when we use this model is we assume economic rationality of the actors, perfect markets, so no distortions, and perfect foresight within a year. And of course, we need to think of this when we interpret the results. So the areas we were looking at in this analysis, you can see to the right. So it's the areas surrounding the North Sea, but also including Poland and Finland. So the way the Balmoral works is that it is often used as minimizing of costs. And the different costs are the fuel costs, operation and maintenance, investment costs, also on transmission, and then taxes on fuels or emissions or other taxes. So we minimize these costs, and we do that subject to some constraints. This could be balance equations, such as ensuring that electricity is supplied in the hour needed. It could be capacity constraints of plants. It could be energy constraints, such as the available potentials in different regions. It could be operational constraints, for for example, if we include ramping, and then we can have apply emission caps or renewable energy targets. The different sector coupling possibilities we looked at in this analysis was electricity from grid to vehicle and from vehicle to grid, also electricity for synthetic fuel generation, electricity used to produce synthetic gas or to produce electricity from synthetic gas. We have electricity for heating and also combined heat and power, and we have synthetic gas for heating as well. So a lot of different options that we can choose between. And we looked at a number of different scenarios. So basically, if we start from the right, in all scenarios, we allow synthetic gas investments. We have decarbonization of the transport sector, and we allow power to heat investments. And then what we distinguish between are whether we have high onshore wind potentials or not, and whether we allow extra investments in transmission in electricity sector or not. And so in the restricted scenario, we have no extra transmission investments and a low onshore wind potential. In the transmission scenario, we allow transmission investments. In the wind, we have high onshore potential. And in the free, we have both. So let's look at some of the results. So on the electricity demand, we can see that the sector coupling leads to higher electricity demand. And in the bottom, you see the classic electricity demand not really increasing, but electricity to synthetic fuels with orange for transport increases, and as does electricity to heat. And this is where we really see an increase in the electricity demands. And this higher electricity demand leads to higher need for variable renewable energy installations. And these variable renewable installations are mainly wind and solar PV. And what you see is that in the wind and the free scenario, we have quite a high share of onshore wind. But if this potential is not available, it's substituted by offshore wind and also solar PV. And we see that there is this competition depending on whether the potential is available or not. And then to some results in terms of what does this mean now? What benefit can it give us to have this sector coupling? We compared the costs. So to the left, you see the base where we have the free scenario being the cheapest. And then you can compare to, for example, if we don't allow investments in power to heat, we have a much higher costs. Actually, it leads to annual savings of around 30% if we allow these investments in power to heat. And if we look at the emissions, we can see that sector coupling leads to around 20% points lower greenhouse gas emissions in the energy sector than if we don't have this sector coupling. So to the left in the circle, you have the base where we have a 92% reduction in the greenhouse gas emissions in the energy sector. And to the right, you see that if we don't allow investments in electricity for transport or electricity for power to heat, then we only get a 71% reduction in the greenhouse gases in the energy sector. So basically the conclusions are that sector coupling facilitates increased electricity demand and variable renewable energy integration. It actually also, we see heat storage capacities increase, as well as electricity and district heating transmission expansion towards 2050. Sector coupling can facilitate lower costs and lower greenhouse gas emissions. And main new electricity demands are within power to heat and power to X from 2035, which can both feed into district heating if we use the excess heat. And then onshore wind potential highly influences offshore wind development, and sector coupling can help integrate this, this wind power. So this was the first article. And then I think I have time for a second article, which zooms in on the transport sector. So this was an analysis on electrofuels in future energy systems, a 2050 case study. And it was together with co-authors Mason Scott Lester and Rasmus Brandstoft. and it was part of the Future Gas project, and you have a link up there if you want to know more. So in this project, we looked at, well, the analysis was about what is the role of the gas grid in the future, but here we're zooming in on the transport sector, which was analyzed with times, and we look at decarbonization almost completely of the transport sector. And here we are focusing on the Danish demand, and we can see that as time goes forward, we will use a lot of electricity in the transport sector. And if we are allowed to import biomass, then we do that, and we also import biofuels to cover the extra demand. And if we don't have import of biomass, then we see a little bit more of electrofuels and hydrogen being used. But if we then shift, you can see we ended around 60 petajoules in 2050. If we shift and we include the international transport demand, we are double the demand in 2050. And we can see that if we allow import of biomass and biofuels, then that is how we cover our extra demand. But if we don't allow this import of biomass, then in 2050, we see a substantial share of electrofuels coming in. So the question becomes, do we believe that we should be allowed to import biofuels from abroad and biomass? And if not, then should we cover the international transport fuels that we need with green fuels, and then maybe we will need quite a lot of electrofuels coming in. So if that is the case, we should of course start early in order to have the full capacity in 2050. So there are different ways we can produce alternative fuels. We can utilize biomass, and we can have the pure biofuels to the left. We can utilize electricity to produce hydrogen, and then have either carbon or nitrogen from the air to produce different electrofuels. Or we can have a combination where we kind of boost biofuels with hydrogen to create e-biofuels. And using the CO2, so basically, if we use fossil CO2 and we capture it and store it, we can assume that the emissions are neutral. But if we use it or simply emit it, we have positive emissions. Whereas on the biogenic side, if we capture CO2 and store it, we can count it as negative. If we emit directly, we can count the emissions as CO2 neutral, but we can also capture the CO2, reuse it, and emit it later. It will still be counted as neutral. So based on this, of course, what we are most keen on using is the biogenic CO2 in order to produce the green fuels. Looking at how much excess heat can we get from different fuel production technologies. These are now data from the technology catalog from the Danish Energy Agency.
I think Marie is frozen. Yep.
Recording in progress.
Marie?
Okay. Maybe people needed a break anyway.
Okay, maybe it's so, but now we hear you perfectly, so please continue.
Marie?
Okay, well, I hope you woke up by that. And yeah, so we did a comparison of the excess heat. How much does it matter for a plant producing an electrofuel? So we have a comparison of a methanol plant with red and ammonia plant with blue, and at different heat prices, how much can they reduce the production costs of the fuels? And you can see to the right, we have the current heat selling price in Denmark, and it would be around 7 or 4% of the production cost that can be reduced. But if we look forward and the heat prices decrease, it might only be a few percent. But of course, as the competition is fierce, any percent point reduction in costs matters. So for this analysis, again, we used Balmoral, but this time together with Optiflow, and we looked at just the Denmark and the surrounding countries. We included investment and operation optimization, high geographical resolution, high temporal resolution, decommissioning of technologies, endogenous electricity prices, and least cost raw socioeconomic optimization. So, and the system we looked at was the power system and the district heating system, but also the gas system, including anaerobic digestion gas catalysis, thermal gasification, and electrolysis. And we also looked at producing liquid fuels for transport, because these different technologies compete for the same resources to supply different services for transport, residential and industrial sector. So, so this is the picture, including the infrastructure and the storage is aligned. We had a quite detailed spatial resolution, so we looked at where are the resources distributed in Denmark. Here you see the manure available, and this is the straw available, which are some of the main resources. We looked at how can we transport resources around and how much would that cost depending on which type of resource. And then we looked at where do we have district heating areas in Denmark. And then we looked at different ways of supplying demands. So we could talk about a biofuel pathway where we need around 102 petajoules to supply 58 petajoules for the transport sector. And this should be held up against the 94 petajoules of straw and wood we have in Denmark. Or we could look at it. Something happened with the sound. Oh, I'll go on. For the electrofuel pathway, we need 3 million tons CO2 plus 23 terawatt hours or 84 petajoules of wind, and this should be held up against the 53 petajoules of electricity generation from wind in Denmark in 2018. So quite substantial amounts of wind turbines. And basically for the e-biofuel pathway, we could have half the demand for biomass and half the demand for wind turbines to supply the same amount. And when we then do this cost minimization, we find that we get around 14 to 46 terawatt hours of electricity consumption for hydrogen production. We have full utilization of the domestic straw and wood, and we mainly see production of e-biofuels. So if you start to the left in the figure, you have the base, and what is below the x-axis is what we consume. So what we see is that we consume domestic biomass plus imported biomass and electricity to produce e-biofuels. If we have more electric vehicles, we simply reduce the fuel demand, and we then reduce the imported biomass consumption and also some electricity. If we, on the other hand, don't allow biomass import, then we see that there's higher electricity consumption, and we also get the pure electrofuels coming into the system. When we look at the district heating side, we can say that we have around 12 terawatt hours of excess heat for district heating, which could cover around 20% of the district heating demand in 2050. We did a sensitivity analysis on the biomass costs, and not surprisingly, if you look at the figure, you have the fuel production, depending on how much up we move the price of biomass, and we increase from 100% to 700%. And you can see that around 300%, we see a swap from biomass fuels to carbon and nitrogen capture fuels. So we do see a high sensitivity to biomass costs in the analysis. So conclusions from this article is that geography matters, both on the resource and energy infrastructure side. Results indicate that domestic biomass potentials in 2050 will not be sufficient in creating a fossil independent energy system in Denmark when we take road, sea and air travel into account. And because of this, the use of electrofuels is crucial and aids in the balancing of electricity grid and also provides heat to district heating networks. Fuels that utilize both hydrogen and biomass prove to be most economically feasible, and also exploits the limited domestic biomass optimally. And furthermore, we didn't find that the existing carbon dioxide potential was the limiting factor. It was not fully utilized unless we had restrictions on biomass import, or biomass costs were significantly higher compared to the projections we used in this study. Finally, a commercial. We did a white paper in ETIPSnet that I was main author of, together with a lot of different brilliant people, and about sector coupling and the concepts and state of art and perspectives, looking at both power to heating and cooling, power to mobility, power to gas and fuels, and giving a status, showing potentials and barriers. And there's also a link to a podcast where we tell about it. And this was part of the Super Power to Gas project. And then there's a list of recent related articles that you might find interesting. And I hope you get access to the PowerPoint. And that was what I had to tell you today. So voila, and I hope you have a few questions and that are still all there.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Now it's complete. Here. Nevertheless, we have some questions. Do we still have connection to Marie Münster?
Yeah, we have it on Zoom, just we are solving this room.
Okay, then we can try to start. So now you are here back again, Marie. Thank you very much for your presentation. And now I would like to ask the audience.
If somebody's saying something to me, I don't hear it. I don't have any sound.
Okay.
Everything is muted.
I try again. Okay. So now it should work?
Yeah.
Okay. So once more, thank you very much, Marie, for your presentation. And now I would like to ask the audience here whether they have questions. Yes, there is one just over there.
Okay, hi, Yannick here, University of Canterbury, New Zealand. Thanks for your great talk, very clear. I enjoyed that a lot. Going back maybe to your first conclusion, that the results and also the modeling approach is very geographic dependent, right? I was wondering if you have any recommendations that you could give us, lessons that you learned that we could apply elsewhere, not only to Denmark. And Denmark is a small country, but similar to New Zealand, right? The world looks at you when you do stuff. And yeah, going back to the question, what lessons learned can be applied elsewhere? Thanks.
Thanks for that question. I think that the issues Denmark are facing are pretty broad. So I think that in many other countries, there may also be a very good idea of how to decarbonize electricity and maybe also heating. I think, of course, from a Danish perspective, what we may be able to illustrate for others are the benefit of utilizing excess heat, of having energy infrastructure to do that. I'm not saying that you should distribute district heating all over New Zealand, but in clusters, in industrial clusters, it may still be feasible to optimize the use of heat and to share. I think that the fact that we need all to focus on transport and industry and agriculture is pretty much the same. I think that the challenges in terms of how much biomass is available, and we don't have biomass available enough for the transport sector, then how can we decarbonize the transport sector using electrofuels, and what are the challenges in terms of ensuring that we have energy enough for that? So I think there are quite a lot of very general learnings to take. In terms of the geography, again, everywhere in the world, I think it's important to say, well, where do we have the resources, the renewable resources, and where do we have energy infrastructure that makes it possible for us to do this combination of placing well in terms of both these. And the more we kind of think of where we place these different, let's say, biorefineries, the cheaper the transition will be. So I think that this sector coupling, which is basically trying to break down, as I see it, silos in thinking that electricity is one thing and I don't know, fuel demand for industry is a completely different one, that we need to have a more holistic view on this and have a good overview of resources and energy infrastructure and demands in order to do this sector coupling and really devise smart systems that can minimize the cost of the green transition. So I think there are quite a lot of things which are completely general and where we are pretty much in the same situation as many other countries.
Next question from Ilya.
Thank you, Professor Stadler. My name is Ilya Batas-Bjelic. I'm from Serbian Academy of Science, Institute of Technical Science. My question is related to the newest achievement of electricity prices and the gas prices, and your comment about vulnerability of sector-coupled energy system to those events, or maybe, let's say, opposite of vulnerability. What is this? This is resilience to these shocks.
Right. Yeah, thanks. I believe that I guess the more we couple sectors, the more suppliers we have for the different services. So the more we can kind of flex so that we can maybe avoid using so much gas in these times and maybe use a bit more biomass at the moment, or similarly more electricity. So I think that the more the sectors are coupled in a smart way, the larger the resilience we can ensure. And this is of course complex, so it has to be done in a smart way. If we don't do it in a smart way, we might end in the other situation. But I do believe that it has a potential to ensure a higher resilience. And surprisingly, for a lot of people, although we have I think close to 60% of the electricity production in Denmark coming from wind power, we still have 99.99, I think, electricity percent of the time. So we do have a quite stable system. We also have a very strong energy infrastructure to support that. But basically, I think that sector coupling and resilience can be a very good match.
Do we, in the meanwhile, have questions online? No? Do we have questions here in the audience? Okay, please. Just in the first row.
Thank you. Thank you for the very nice and so-called eye-opening presentation. And thank you for bringing us this important issue to this SDEWES meeting. My question is, if I did not miss anything in your nice presentation, the geothermal energy is not appearing anywhere besides solar and wind. Is there any specific reason for doing that?
This is a very good question. Thank you. So in this area, there's not much geothermal potential for electricity production, but there is geothermal potential for heat production, and it is a point that we want to improve our modeling with, and I do believe it will also contribute. I still believe that that electricity may be the main provider of as an energy source also for heating, but I do think it has definitely has potential to contribute. So thanks for that question. I'm working on improving that part and looking into recent cost estimates, which are getting better.
Thank you so much.
We do see what can we say, an industrialization, commercialization of that at the moment. So I do believe that costs are coming down and becoming more relevant.
While we are looking for new questions, I also would like to ask you one. You had been investigating to use the waste heat when you produce e-fuels. What is the share of waste heat that is generated when you generate e-fuels, and at which temperature levels do you get them? And the next question is, where will you place then the e-fuel production facilities? Maybe they're not where the wind parks are, but maybe in the city centers?
Yeah, so I showed a graph with that. I don't know if I should share it again, but as I showed you, that there's quite a big difference in how much excess heat do you have depending on which type of electrolyzer and which type of catalysis you're looking at. So that differs quite a lot, and also the temperatures. So of course, if you have these high temperatures where you could maybe produce steam from, you would want to either integrate it, or you would want to use this maybe in a nearby industrial facility. So yes, there is a strong debate in Denmark about whether, for example, we should, on the energy islands we are planning to make, whether we should have the hydrogen production on energy islands, or we should have it close to cities where we might be able to use the excess heat. So this is an ongoing debate, and there's no final answer to that. But I can say that in the west of Denmark, in Esbjerg, where we have a lot of wind, we do see hydrogen facilities being planned, and also plans for utilizing excess heat from one is an ammonia facility, the other is a hydrogen facility. So we do see plans to utilize the excess heat of these facilities. So at the moment, we're bringing the wind as electricity to shore, and using it there, but in the further future, we are looking into possibilities of producing hydrogen on energy islands.
Then I think we have an online question.
Yes, it says, excellent work and presentation. Thanks a lot. And then it says, you didn't analyze the scenario complete direct e-transport without e-fuels. You don't take this option feasible. Well, the main fuels that we're using are for shipping or for aviation and a little bit for trucks. So for these, it's quite difficult to see a full direct electrification. So I believe that for some of the heavy transport, we will continue to need fuels, and therefore we didn't see a full electrification of the transport sector.
So you didn't take into account that you also will have the heavy transport on trucks with batteries, that you excluded completely? And also, did you exclude to have overhead lines on the motorways? That might also be an alternative?
No, I think those were actually included as possibilities. We saw quite a lot of batteries in trucks, but not all, and not for the very heavy, very long distance. But I believe, I have to remember, I believe that we included the possibility of electric highways, but that it was quite a costly option, and therefore it didn't come through strong. But we've been looking more into it since, and then I don't remember if that changed substantially. So yes, I believe it was part of it, but there are, as you know, especially with the trucks, there's a lot of debate on how electric they can go, and everything is developing really fast. So we may be able to go that direction. In Denmark, we haven't actually looked much at electric highways from the political side. Some of us are pushing for that to happen, particularly because there's strong debates in Germany and in Sweden. And it would be weird that Denmark then wouldn't be available as a transit country. So I hope that there will be more looked into that. And of course, the more we can directly electrify, the more efficient the system. So this is definitely options we should look into. And luckily, the batteries for vehicles are also really developing fast at the moment. So yes, the more electricity in the transport sector, the better, but some indirect electricity may be needed in the form of e-fuels.
Thank you. Do you have more questions here in the audience? Yes, once more.
Hi, Yannick again, thanks. I always have questions for you. Hydrogen imports or hydrogen exports, what are your view, again, on a smaller country like Denmark?
Yeah, so for this analysis, we did not take the possibility to import or export hydrogen into account. We had to produce our own consumption. But we are currently in Denmark looking into, actually we have a very large wind power potential in the North Sea, and we have a larger potential than our electricity demand. So the question being, should we export electricity to our neighbors, help them decarbonize, utilize this resource? Should we convert it to hydrogen and sell it, for example, in the Ruhr district in Germany or to the Netherlands? Or should we convert it into liquid e-fuels and sell it on a global market? And these are the discussions ongoing. And as you could hear from the examples from Esbjerg, one of the projects is looking into the possibility of producing hydrogen to export to Germany, and the other one is looking into converting to ammonia and then using for agriculture or for shipping. So we are exploiting all potentials, and we also have agreements with our neighbors of electricity transmission. So we're kind of undecided, I guess, exactly which way to go, and maybe we will go all three ways. But yes, I think that we do have potential for exporting hydrogen, and I think it will happen.
More questions? Or while you're getting your questions, I would have a more methodological question. You mentioned when you have your optimization approach, you either use, or you both, I'm not sure, rolling horizon attempt or the myopic attempt. Could you explain the difference and which gives then the better performance in your optimization algorithms?
Thanks, yes. So if we do the myopic, we kind of know what's going to happen within 1 year. We do our optimization and then we look into what happens next year, then we do our optimization there. But if we have the rolling horizon, we may have a foresight that includes what happens in the next 10 years. We do our investment, we move 5 years ahead, and then we know for the next 10 years what happens again. And this means that we're not completely blind to the fact that something is going on in terms of policies of decreasing emissions and so on, but we don't know. We also don't know exactly what will happen for the next 10, 40 years. So the rolling horizon is an attempt to have a more kind of realistic investment path. And it's particularly important if you don't have very linear developments. If you have linear developments, then maybe it's less important. But if you have kind of policies changing over time, then the rolling horizon may give you a more realistic idea about how do investments decisions, how are they taken. So this is the difference, and we normally, now that we've developed the rolling horizon possibility, we normally use that.
Thank you. Do we have now more questions here in the audience? Yes, we have.
My name is Luís Serrano. I come from Polytechnic of Leiria in Portugal, and well, I take the liberty to put you my opinion, to know your criticism about my ideas, because I think we are facing a huge problem in the near future, because we have now seen that the fossil fuels are increasing their prices because they are taxating about the CO2 emissions and so on, and the increase of biofuels use. And we saw also that electricity has been recently, production of electricity has been rising the prices also. So I believe that we are facing a problem about economy of energy. We lose the times of cheap energy. That's what we have now. And in the near future, I think that the energy will be much more higher costs. And I think in the perspective of the next few years, the nuclear plants are being shut down, the thermal plants are being, mainly the coal thermal plants are being shut down. So I think the price of energy will be rise in the next years. So what is your opinion about this, and if it is feasible? One more add to this discussion is that governments pick a lot of money from the taxation of fuels. So 2/3 of the main price of the fuels is taxes. So this also goes to end if we decrease the fossil fuels consumption. So all this package brings us a new paradigm on energy prices. What do you can give us about this scenario? Thank you.
Thanks. That's a complex question, but I think that the very high prices we see at the moment are not kind of, how can I say it? I think it's due to flaws in the market as it is, and due to maybe not monopolies, but power being exerted. And maybe also due to lack of capacity. So from my optimistic point of view, this will not continue, this situation where we see these high prices. I think we might on gas, but I don't think we will on electricity prices. So with an optimistic view, it's a flaw in how the market is working, and when we have sufficient capacities installed, then prices will decrease. I do think that in the future we might see more fluctuating prices, in the sense that we will have more hours with high prices, or very high prices, and we will have more hours with low prices. So maybe leaving some business potentials for people owning storages and supplying storage services. So that's on the price side. On the taxing of fuels, I think that for some foreseeable time, quite a lot of taxes could come in as CO2 taxes. And that might be a way to move forward in nearby, but of course you're right, in the long term, when we are not using fossil fuels anymore and we hopefully don't have a lot of CO2 emissions, then governments will have to look into other ways of getting money to get the society running. But whether they do that the one way or the other way, I don't have a strong opinion on that.
Then I think we have a new online question.
Right, yeah, it says 102 petajoule biomass potential in Denmark. Does it represent 100% biomass potential, or only 33% plus 33% addition for fertilizer and 33% for farming? So the number I was giving was for straw and wood specifically, so it's only part of what we have. Firstly, and secondly, it's kind of the part that we think it's sustainable to remove without removing too much, because of course you might still need some in the agricultural sector. So this is the question for that. It's not the full Danish potential. It's maybe more like 200 petajoules if you take the full Danish potential of all the biomasses, as I remember it.
Is there a last question here in the audience? We are approaching the coffee break. I don't see any questions anymore. So I would like to thank you once more, Marie, that you shared your work together with us, and hopefully in 2 years we see in person again here in Dubrovnik. So once more, thank you very much.
Thank you, and thanks for the nice questions. And I hope you will have a wonderful conference, and I hope I can join you in 2 years.